Hi, everybody. Good to see you all out. I'm Kyle Shelton. I'm the Deputy Director of the Kinder Institute. Thanks for coming to this Urban Reads, the first of 2020. The Institute's Urban Reads series showcases published works by local and national urban experts, and I think it's a really great opportunity for us to learn from other places and for us to share with them what's happening that's really exciting in Houston. Tonight, make sure you are tweeting using hashtag KIUrbanReads, and you can follow us for the live play-by-play, if you need to relive it in the hours after the event, at Rice Kinder Inst, INST. Just one logistical note for questions at the end. We do note cards, which are available if you don't have them already. There will be staff members walking around with them, and you can fill those out and pass them up. And Stephen and I will be talking about some questions that I have and yours as well. If you haven't already, browse this bookstore. Our great partners are out there selling Stephen's new book, Better Buses and Better Cities, and he'll be signing right after the Q&A. So at the end, I'm actually going to ask that you let him escape to the signing space. And if you have burning questions, you just have to buy a book and ask him. So I think by way of introduction, probably many of the folks in this room know that I think this is a perfect time for this conversation in Houston. There's a lot of stuff that's going on that meshes. Obviously, it's mentioned and featured in Stephen's book, but also there's much that we're working on here that goes well beyond what he discusses. Metro Next was just approved in November, which sets the stage for really major transportation investments in the region. Metro is also nearing the completion of the Uptown BRT. Just today, the City of Houston's Resilience Plan was released, which features a lot of transportation-oriented action items and dovetails really nicely with a lot of existing initiatives. There's, of course, ongoing discussion about major highway projects like I-45 and how transit fits into there. And I think something that I certainly have noticed in my 6 years here, growing momentum around transit advocacy and what transit and mobility can mean for Houston and our region, whether it's through groups like Link Houston or Bike Houston or the many other entities and individuals kind of advocating for what we want to see. And so I think it's really great that we have Stephen Higashide here tonight from Transit Center. He's the Director of Research there at Transit Center, which is a New York-based foundation supporting innovation in urban transportation all across the country. We've had the pleasure to partner with Transit Center in previous years, and I always keep an eye out for their great work and encourage you to do that as well. At Transit Center, Stephen develops policy guides and leads workshops that help cities enact transit-supportive policy, and his research has been widely cited by mainstream and industry media, including The Washington Post, Vox, and Wired, and a personal favorite, 99% Invisible, a great podcast. If you haven't listened to it yet, I suggest, again, to fulfill your appetite after this conversation begins feel free to listen to it tonight. So without further ado, I'll allow Stephen to come up and talk to us about his book, Better Buses, Better Cities, and then I'll come back up to do a Q&A.
All right. Thank you so much, Kyle. Thanks, folks here in Houston. I'm not quite sure if I'm supposed to have a clicker to advance these, and maybe I'll just let folks know when it's time to advance. It really means a lot to me to be here in Houston, because as it turns out, and as I wrote about in the book, Houston has a lot of lessons to teach other cities about how to make buses work. And so I'll talk a little bit about what those lessons are, as well as lessons from other cities that we can benefit from here in Houston. So if you go to the next slide. Is that right? Or maybe I'm supposed to advance to the next slide, sorry. Here we go. All right. So, as Kyle mentioned, I'm the Director of Research at Transit Center. We are a foundation based in New York, and the way we work to make cities more just, sustainable, and prosperous through better transit is in a few different ways. We provide grants to local organizations that are working on campaigns for better transit in their communities. We bring together people who work at transit agencies at convenings and workshops to learn from each other. And we also conduct research on what makes transit attractive to people, who rides transit and why. And in this role, I'm often talking to city leaders and making the case that the transportation technology that we most need our cities to adopt is, in fact, the bus. We take 4.7 billion trips a year on the bus in the United States. And yet, so many of those trips end up being miserable, slow, crowded, circuitous. You're sort of standing there on the side of the road without a shelter or a sidewalk. But it doesn't have to be that way, and it really can't be that way if we are going to address so many of the most pressing challenges that face our cities. It can't be that way if we're going to address the urgent need of climate change, if we're going to confront the reality that transportation is now the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the US. And we have to confront the fact also that when we talk about decarbonizing the transportation sector, we really are dealing with the day-to-day trips we make to work, to school, to the grocery store, to everything we need to live our lives. We're not going to fix this through building high-speed rail or by flying less, as important as those things are. We're going to fix it by looking really squarely at the sort of day-to-day needs in the economy. And when you look at all the scientific modeling around this, whether it's local models, state models, national models, international climate modeling, they all come to this conclusion that, yes, it's really important that we electrify the private vehicle fleet, and yet it's not enough. This is just one example from the California Air Resources Board showing that for California to meet its climate goals, not only will every new vehicle have to be electric or zero emission by 2050, but Californians also have to drive 15% less. And that means, both in California and across the US, we have to build cities and build neighborhoods where we can make shorter trips and where we have to drive for fewer of those trips. That means robust transportation options. Why else do we need great public transit and great bus service? It's to confront the crisis of inequality that exists in so many of our cities. This is a map showing, what jobs you can access if you have a car in New Orleans, and it's a pretty good amount of access. Here is what that same map looks like if you don't have access to a private vehicle. That is just a smaller life. It's a smaller set of opportunities that makes it so much harder for low-income people and low-income families to thrive. And you can also sort of flip that over and say that this is an enormous problem for local businesses that need reliable access to a workforce. Additionally, when we speak about the economy, transit becomes essential because as cities grow, and Houston is a very fast-growing place, as cities grow, the private car simply cannot scale to meet that growth. A simple bus lane can carry 2 to 4 times as many people per hour as a general traffic lane. And once you start talking about the kind of heavy-duty bus rapid transit, like that is going in the ground in Uptown, or the kind of sort of rail transit way like you have over here on Main Street, now you're talking tens of thousands of people an hour. Without that kind of great transit, as the city grows, you end up having to destroy big parts of the city to build 5-story parking garages and 10-lane highways, and you end up diminishing a lot of what makes cities great places to be and what makes them great drivers of the economy. So sort of the good news when it comes to all this is that when you look at what it actually takes to create a bus system that's attractive to people, it's actually pretty simple, and it has very little to do with making buses sexy or coming up with a great branding campaign that's going to reduce the stigma of buses. The stigma of buses goes away when you actually provide good service. Service that comes often so that you don't have to build your life around a schedule. Service that is fast and competitive with driving, that's dependable, that you can walk to, that's a good deal for your wallet, and that's a dignified experience. You have a place to wait where you're protected from the weather, and you have a great place to walk. These are all pretty simple things. And in the book, I go into quite a lot of detail about sort of the different planning aspects of how you make this happen. Houston is a place where, there are a lot of people, I know some of the folks in the room right here who really understand this. because Houston has been working for the past 6 years, done a lot of work to make the bus a more attractive way to get around. In 2015, there's this has become famous around the country, Houston's bus network redesign, which replaced a network which fundamentally hadn't changed in a few decades with a network that brought frequent transit service to some of the newer employment centers, which brought 1 million additional households and 1 million additional jobs within walking distance of bus service that was coming at least every 15 minutes. And then just a few months ago, you have the passage of the Metro Next plan. This is really going to be a big deal for Houston because it's one of the first times that Houston is really talking about bus priority, about using this design toolkit of bus lanes and traffic signal timing and priority and many other sort of design elements to create bus service that's fast and competitive with driving. If there's one element of that recipe I mentioned before that perhaps bears sort of special attention in Houston, it's the pedestrian experience. This is so clear when you walk around in a lot of neighborhoods in Houston, which is the case in a lot of cities that grew up sort of on the same timeline that Houston did. But the truth is, most bus trips are a walking trip on at least one end. That's borne out in basically all the survey data. And you can make a bus fast, frequent, you can make the schedule reliable, but people are not going to experience that as a great trip if it also involves crossing 6, 8 lanes of traffic, running across with no traffic light, having an obstruction in the path, or waiting in the mud. That's really, really important to get a handle on. Metro Next is really a new chapter for transit in Houston in a lot of ways. And I think that if Houston is going to be successful in implementing it, in a lot of ways you have to make sure that you are sort of continually relearning some of the lessons from that bus network redesign. I devoted a whole chapter to the bus network redesign in the book, and one of the things that was so impressive to me was the fact that not only was it sort of a great transit plan from a planning perspective, but there was a really great political plan that came with it. Houston Metro had hundreds of meetings with elected officials. They had day-long planning exercises with major employers and major stakeholders so that when the network redesign actually came out, people weren't caught by surprise. Organizations that represented transit riders, employers that had lots of employees who were using transit, civic organizations, they could see that their input from those sessions was reflected in the plan. And that meant that the blowback wasn't what you see sometimes in other places. Change is always hard, but this way the change didn't come across as an ambush. And when I looked at other places around the country that have successfully made changes to their bus system, you nearly always find an alliance across sectors. You find advocacy groups and civic organizations outside government pulling a lot of weight in making the case for better transit. You have, of course, it's very important to have elected leaders who are willing to be sort of personal champions for transit. And then you have champions inside the bureaucracy, so sort of heroic bureaucrats, you could say, people who are willing to really think about how do you set up public processes in a way that makes it easier for these other allies to do their job and make the case that transit's really important in a city. And when you don't have that, you find that even though the recipe for a great bus service is very simple, you find that it just doesn't happen on the street sometimes. And that's because in so many cities, transit riders are not organized. Transit riders are more likely to be low-income people, people of color, the people who are marginalized by our political system. And you also find sort of bigger political, structural, legislative challenges, like the fact that if you want to build or widen a highway, you can get federal money to do that with very few strings. But the federal programs for transit have a lot of strings attached. It's a much more onerous process, and that's why so many times you see transit agencies instead going to the voters. It's really not a level playing field, and that's why it's so important that you have a strong, engaged coalition pushing to overcome this, and hopefully, in the long run, undoing some of these structural barriers. So I want to sort of in the last third of this talk dial in a little bit on this notion of strategic, strong public agencies and talk about some of the public transportation agencies from around the country that I think have a lot to teach us folks here in Houston. One of the things that came across in this book, so what you're seeing here is a screenshot from a website of a bus lane project in Washington, D.C., the 16th Street Northwest project. This is a project where planning began in the first year of the Obama administration, and it's still not on the street. There is a huge sort of problem in the transportation industry where a lot of bus lane projects are planned as if they were highway, or as if they were sort of mega projects with multiple rounds of design and then months of public meetings at each round. And we simply cannot ask that of the public. We can't expect that someone in a neighborhood who wants better transit is going to stay engaged through this 6-year planning process. They may not even live in that neighborhood after 6 years. And we certainly don't have time to spend 6 years on every individual project. So what I am seeing in more and more places is what's called a tactical transit approach to this, where transportation agencies are finding places on the street where there's a really strong case to prioritize the bus. They are testing out what a bus lane might look like with some paint, or in some cases, even just cones. They will put the cones or the paint in for weeks. They'll survey riders to understand how it's affecting folks. They'll collect data in the neighborhood. And then often a lot of those projects, there are some projects like this in DC, Boston, Los Angeles, those projects are becoming permanent after just a few weeks or a few months. And this isn't a replacement for the kind of heavy-duty bus rapid transit, the kind that's like Uptown BRT, but it is a really great way to get people to understand the concept of what bus priority looks like in a place that doesn't have much of a history of it. It's a great way to show bus riders what the benefits are, to get them excited. It's also a really good way to show folks in neighborhoods that the sky is not falling because we took some parking spaces for this bus lane, that things actually are still moving fine. So this is, I think, a really important trend. There's also new ways we can think about the public process, public engagement, and you can actually do community engagement in a way that helps groups organize around transit. Metro Transit in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, contracts with community-based organizations. They contract with over a dozen community groups to do public outreach for a project they have looking at how and where to site bus shelters. This is really important for a few reasons. First, by going through neighborhood groups, they're able to get public input that is actually demographically representative of transit riders. That is really hard to do when you're dealing with a ridership base where often English as a second language, or folks who don't have time to show up to the traditional 6 p.m. open house meetings, but they were able to get equitable input. And because the agency is paying community groups, those groups actually ended up being the same types of groups that later on are advocating for transit at the ballot box with elected officials. Seattle, a really good example of a place that has tackled one of the silos that really bedevils transit. The fact that transit agencies run bus service, but half or more of what makes bus service successful is handled by city government. And in most cities, there's not a single person whose job it is to make transit work better. Seattle really breaks the mold in a couple different ways. At the bus agency, King County Metro, they have a whole team of traffic engineers that basically make house calls to all the little municipalities, doing the work to show how changing the traffic light here or changing a turn restriction here is going to shave seconds or minutes off a bus route. These are sort of smaller suburban places that don't have that capacity in-house, so the transit agency takes it on. And conversely, the Seattle Department of Transportation, even though they basically don't run very much transit service, they have metrics, they have goals where they know that transit is essential to how the city works. And they also, over the past 10 years, have gone from having a couple of transit advisors in the mayor's office to a 28-person transit division inside city government that is helping to plan this very long, impressive pipeline of bus priority projects. That does, that takes hiring people. It takes understanding that when you want to build strong public agencies, that means creating new capacities that didn't exist anymore. And it requires sort of understanding that when you do it in an intentional way, bigger government can be better government. It can lead to better transportation outcomes. So there's a lot more that I could say, and I look forward to having that conversation with Kyle and with the questions that with you folks submit. I'll just conclude by, I think restating something that I really came to understand after talking to many of the folks inside Houston Metro, some of the board members, some of the elected officials who had worked on this bus network redesign, which is that when you want to win better transportation outcomes, on the one hand, it's really important to have technical knowledge of what makes effective transit networks, but you also have to understand how to navigate the networks of power. That's something that has really characterized Houston's approach to transit, and I really hope that remains core to the way the city approaches improving transit in the years ahead. Thanks, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much. That was a great presentation. And again, it's so great to see everybody here tonight to talk some more about this. I wanted to start, please don't be offended that I wrote in the book. I'm a historian, so I took lots of notes, and I just wrote all the questions right here adjacent to the great writing.
I definitely don't take it personally.
Okay. I was wondering, you do a nice job sort of setting up, I'd say, a lot of the narrative around buses and around some of the history that has led to where we are today. Can you maybe start by just giving us a little bit more of that background as you understand it, and sort of how we got to a situation where in many cities buses are, or bus improvements are, sort of invisible to most folks?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the themes of the book, and I sort of mentioned it when I was sort of presenting, is the fact that transit is in the poor situation that it is in a lot of US cities because transit riders have been marginalized by the political system. And so when you look at sort of the really sorry state of bus networks in a lot of places, it's part of the same history of urban planning that led to freeways destroying urban neighborhoods. And in a lot of, and in basically most US cities, destroying predominantly black and brown neighborhoods so that sort of white professionals could have a quicker trip to the suburbs. These were things that were sold as improving access to the suburbs, but actually in urban places often had the reverse effect, really made it harder to get around. And I think that results in many places in transit being seen as invisible politically. And so much of the work about changing that is by making transit and transit riders visible again, by organizing, whether that is more what we sometimes call grass tops organizing, by getting organizations like AARP and the hospital and major employers to move transit up on the agenda, or if it's actually organizing in neighborhoods and organizing the transit riders themselves. And I really think you actually really need both. One of the things that's really interesting is that the same coalition that can convince, say, the city council in Indianapolis to raise its income tax to expand bus service, the same coalition that can convince voters in Los Angeles to raise money for transit, it often turns out to be really different from who can convince neighborhood leaders or a city council member to stop blocking a bus lane. The fight at the street level is really different from the fight at the ballot box, it turns out.
Well, and that's actually, and sorry, before I ask this, I forgot to remind you, if you have questions, Sarah and Chris have blank cards, and you have a few more minutes as I'm asking to sketch those out. Feel free to add a hand-drawn bus. I'm more likely to be attracted to that one. You make the case in the book, and I think you're beginning to lay it out here too, that transit advocates have to prepare to, as you say, win the fight and not just kind of be involved in it. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means and sort of how that meshes with the last comment you're saying about those different coalitions?
Sure. You know, so my background is in transportation advocacy. Before coming to the Transit Center, I worked for basically an environmental group in New York City focused on transportation issues. And I think sometimes I was guilty, and I see other folks who are sort of guilty of just doing watchdogging, of looking at the budget every year and basically providing some commentary on how good or bad it was for sustainable transportation. That's really different from taking a campaign mindset and actually asking yourself, we want to win a bus lane on this corridor in the next year. What do we have to do that? Who are the people who have the decisions to make this happen? Who are the people they listen to, and how do we organize those people? Like, is it important to organize the people at the church that's on that corridor? Is it important to organize the people at this specific social club? That's a sort of more power mapping or campaign approach. So just to give like one example, in the book I talk about this tactical transit lane in Boston where the city was willing to try out this tactical transit approach. They put a bus lane on the street, but they were actually still quite nervous about neighborhood blowback. And so this organization, the Livable Streets Alliance, got volunteers from the neighborhood to stand at bus stops along that corridor 3 days a week for 8 weeks and collect postcards from riders and build relationships with them. And they sent all the postcards to the mayor, and the postcards were from people basically saying like, oh, I'm a nurse, Mayor Walsh, and like a reliable bus trip matters to me because I don't want to miss my shift. And so that really, that's really important. That's when you start to actually build power.
And that's actually, I think, a really nice segue to one of the other things that you touch on in the book is thinking about how, whether it's the agency or the city or whoever's making the decisions about our transit system, actually value the riders in a different way. And I think that's a great example of that. Can you tell us a little bit more about some other examples or ways that, or why that's so powerful and how that ties into this question of getting better transit?
So I think one of the things you're getting at is that there is sometimes a mindset among some transit planners, definitely not all, but this feeling that people who don't own cars are just going to ride transit no matter what. And there's a specific piece of planning jargon for that. The term is captive rider. And because these folks are supposedly captive to transit, we don't have to worry so much about how good their service is. Let's focus all our efforts on trying to get people out of their cars and onto transit. And that often translates into focusing a lot of money on like extending rail out into the suburbs, a lot of money on amenities, branding, Wi-Fi, things that make transit feel sort of flashy. And yet the truth is, everyone has choices. And that's what the research bears out, that even if you don't own a car yourself, you have other choices. And those choices might not be so good. That might mean that you have to take rides with a friend. It might mean that you choose to walk 3 miles to work. It might ultimately mean that you save up and buy a used car. But everyone has choices, and you have to give every transit rider sort of this respect because you can lose everyone. And actually, I talked to one of the folks who definitely doesn't believe that, who believes that you have to fight for every rider, is Kurt Lurson, who's the vice president of, I believe it's service planning here at Houston Metro. He was very emphatic about that when I interviewed him for the book.
Great, wonderful. I was incredibly excited, and again, this is going to be the nerdiness in me coming out, by the table you have in the middle here that describes all of the intricacies of the federal transit programming, and some of what you discussed in your presentation about the difficulty of funding transit. And linking this discussion of the local advocacy and even some of the leading agencies like our own here, how does the activism that you're talking about, how do the neighborhoods and the communities and the city coalitions help support leading agencies at that state and national level to either understand those systems or understand how to access that funding or push to change it? Have you seen any examples of that?
Yeah. So I think one of the, there are a lot of ways in which federal transportation funding is sort of inequitable and slanted against transit. And yet there's actually also a lot of hidden flexibility in federal transportation funding. You may remember the chart from earlier showing that about 80% of federal transportation funding goes to so-called highway programs. But most of those programs are actually very flexible. And states have the power to spend a lot of that funding on transit, on complete streets, biking and walking. They have the power to sort of to flex that funding, and they basically, for the most part, choose not to do it because of sort of state politics, which often are biased against cities. And so there is the potential for local advocacy groups, in places like Houston and Austin and San Antonio. You could imagine there being a sort of urban alliance that comes together and asks for, say, the Texas Department of Transportation to change how it is spending some of that money. And while I'm, not an expert on local politics here, I believe that some of that has happened in relation to Vision Zero, that, recently the Texas Department of Transportation has agreed to spend a lot of money on improving sort of walkability and road safety in ways that are a bit unprecedented. So that, I think, shows what could be possible if it was oriented towards transit instead.
Yeah, so kind of building up some of those local coalitions, combining them and continuing the similar push. That's great.
Yeah, and then of course there's the fact that ultimately all this bubbles up in the sense that what do members of Congress really care about? They care about hearing from local groups. So local policy and federal policy, it's ultimately not that separate from each other.
And we had a recent example of that this week with the proposed budget from the president's office actually including more transit than it had in any year of his administration. It's easy to go from zero to a lot more. But I think that's an indication of the advocacy and push for transit funding finding its way even up to that federal level. A couple questions have come in from the audience sort of talking about what you mentioned around sidewalks and sort of the concept, I would say, of first, last mile and how we think about whether that's from sidewalk improvements to some of the quality of stops that you talked about and even some of the new technological and micromobility modes that we're seeing in studies. What are your thoughts on how those tie to this broader discussion about buses and that need to connect buses to it, regardless of what that first, last mile looks like?
Wow, that's a lot of topics.
Do it in 100 words.
Honestly, I think that we should be outraged about the state of sidewalks in America. I think that it is I think it is truly bizarre that we just accept that in a lot of places sidewalks are the responsibility of private property owners when everything else in the right-of-way is government responsibility. And we see the kind of the wretched results of that. And in the book, I talk about both some incremental things that transportation agencies can do, but also the need to really radically rethink this. From an incremental perspective, there are some pretty good examples of transit agencies taking the lead, of transit agencies, because these are agencies that have more planning capacity, more funding than some small municipalities. They'll do the studies of where are the most important places to improve sidewalks near transit, and then they'll go around and try to convince municipalities to spend money on it. TriMet in Portland, Oregon is a great example of that. But I actually think we really need a fundamental reimagining of this. I mean, the Americans with Disabilities Act is an unfunded mandate for transit. And what would it look like if it was a funded mandate? If all of a sudden the federal government was setting aside billions of dollars a year to fix the sidewalk gaps? Because it's not just Houston, it's Austin, Nashville, Denver. All of these places they do these sidewalk studies and come up with these findings that they have to spend $1 billion or more to build sidewalks on all their streets, these huge gaps. And even in places with traditional urban fabric like New York City or Philadelphia, you still see these lawsuits because like the curb ramps at the intersection aren't up to code. And so places like New York City and Philadelphia are having to spend billions of dollars on bringing that up. And I just don't think that we can maintain this status quo where you force people to sue to get sort of fair access to being able to travel around. I think we really need to rethink sidewalks.
Yeah, and like you said, that's how folks are getting to the bus stops in the first place, one way or the other. There's a lot of questions about, and I don't know if we, in our conversations ahead of this, actually touched on this, but the discussion nationally around free fares and sort of how that fits in. And the Metro Board had recently considered that and looked into it a little further, and I believe stayed the discussion for the moment. I could be wrong on that final outcome, but I'm curious how that type of discussion fits into like everything from valuing the customer to thinking about how we're paying for these systems and all
Yeah. I feel like this answer is not going to make me the most popular because I'm going to try to put some nuance in it. I generally don't support free transit in a place where the agency is as large as Houston Metro is. And yet at the same time, I think the free transit conversation is an important one because it gets at a lot of things that are really important in transit. So some of the arguments that are made for making transit free are that it makes the customer experience really seamless. You don't have to worry about, not having your fare card. You don't have to worry about, if you don't have a smartphone, not having a mobile ticketing app. It means that you do away with fare enforcement that is often discriminatory, so that makes transit more welcoming. It can improve transit operations because people don't spend as much time sort of boarding the bus, getting in line. So affordability is a barrier for low-income people. So all of these are really important issues to address. However, I believe at larger transit agencies, there are ways to address all of them which don't have the same trade-offs that completely getting rid of the fare and all the fare revenue does. You can have, if you're, to speed up buses, you can have all-door boarding. To create a seamless customer experience, you can put a lot of thought into the fare system where fare cards are sold. You can decriminalize fare evasion. You can create targeted low-income fare programs. These all get at the really important benefits that we've been talking about while still maintaining this really stable source of revenue that's really important for agencies. And the reason why I feel like why I'm sort of uncomfortable with the trade-off right now is that transit is so sparse in most US cities that most low-income people are not choosing it. Here in Houston and in places like Kansas City, which is talking about making transit free, and in Los Angeles, transit is cheap, but a majority of low-income people are still choosing to get around by car, often at ruinous consequences. We are at the highest level of automobile debt in recorded US history, and people often go in and out of car ownership because as soon as something goes wrong with the car, you have to get rid of it, and that causes huge instability. And so I feel like the priority has to be dramatically increasing service so that it becomes viable for people. Transit's just too sparse. Cheap transit hasn't solved that problem, and I don't think free transit will either.
Yeah, and I think to me that feeds right back into those 6 or 7 key points you have, right? Like the fare is not the thing that is making everybody's choice, right? It's the flexibility, it's the availability, it's the quality. That ties right in. Numerous questions on your read on what is the most exciting project, what's the most exciting initiative you're seeing either in some of these case study cities that you're looking at or just nationally, internationally. What are the things you're most excited about as a transit researcher and advocate?
Recently, one of the things that's really exciting in some of our most congested cities is people are willing to go way beyond the bus-only lane and starting to say, well, how about a bus-only street? In San Francisco, on Market Street, they essentially banned private cars. In New York City, on 14th Street, they've converted that into a transit way. And that's really cheap. There's almost no infrastructure there, but it's really sped up bus service. There's been essentially no impact on traffic on the side streets. They are allowing, emergency vehicles and trucks on those streets, so it turns out to be good for business and good for people's health. And you actually walk around those places, and it's just amazing how much more pleasant it is. People feel empowered to cross the street basically anytime, anywhere. It excites local elected officials and people living in the neighborhoods in a way that goes beyond a lot of the sort of more incremental transit projects that I've seen. So it's something that I think is going to spread to more places.
What's your sense of what that process was for that street in terms of the advocacy and some of what we talked about earlier tonight of how they got there?
Well, it's a mix of organizing and luck. And the luck part is in New York City, there was this proposed. They were going to have to shut down a subway line to do some sort of sorely needed maintenance. And sort of it turned out actually that they didn't have to completely shut it down. They could scale it back instead. But that's where the idea for shutting down 14th Street came from. It's like, we're going to have this incredibly important transit line go down. We better have some actual capacity to replace it. And then it took really strong organizing to get over opposition from. It was a small group of folks in the neighborhood, but they were folks who happened to be very politically connected and who filed a lot of lawsuits to try to stop 14th Street from happening. And the good news is that now that the transitway is in effect, there's really good data showing that it didn't change traffic speeds at all on the side streets. And that's so often the case that traffic, it's not like water where if you stop the pipe, the water just overflows and has to go somewhere. It's more like a gas where you take part of the system out, but there are lots of other places for that traffic to go. There are lots of different ways that people change how they travel, routes they take, modes they take. It turned out to be a pretty dynamic system.
Yeah, great. You don't tackle this too much in the book, I don't think, but you said you guys are studying at Transit Center, so I'm going to call it fair game. Can we talk a little bit about what are the pressures, the dual pressures between transportation investments and issues with rapid neighborhood change, gentrification, displacement, and how or if you know of any ways that these cities that are making these really needed improvements are confronting that?
Yeah. I mean, I wish we were completely clear on the policy solutions for stopping displacement. I think this is something that a lot of people are thinking about now, and it's really overdue. I really think that as a transit advocate, you can't go into a neighborhood and advocate for these types of improvements if you don't have a real response to how are we going to protect against displacement. And so I think that I basically think that, transit advocates cannot be single issue advocates, that it's really important to become fluent on things like, well, how do you reform the eviction process? What is the role of things like, even rent control in some certain circumstances? It's still not an issue that I personally feel all that expert in, but I think it's something that folks who work on transportation have to take seriously in a way that maybe we haven't in the past.
Yeah.
And it's just in all the cities, all the cities all the sort of major transit cities in the US are also places that are seeing these enormous housing crises. And you're starting to see pretty ambitious responses in Minneapolis, for example, where they agreed to rezone the entire city to allow 3 and 4 unit, basically triplexes citywide. Oregon has basically done away with single-family zoning, or you could call it, in most places apartments are banned, and Oregon undid the ban. In California, they're having that conversation about whether there should be a massive upzoning around transit. So it's a conversation that has to happen. I can't say that I have all the answers, but it's not something that anyone can afford to shy away from.
Well, it seems that a parallel there is what you highlighted for bringing transit engineers into traffic engineers into transit agencies, bringing transit folks into city government. I mean, there's maybe a case to be made for transit folks in housing departments and housing folks in transportation agencies.
Right. I think that's a great point. And actually, at some transit agencies, not that this by itself is going to be enough to address the housing crisis, but actually a lot of transit agencies in those places where the market is so overheating have really taken strong policy stances on using transit agency land to build affordable housing, which is good for the transit agency in the long run, because that creates a group of people right next to transit who are pretty likely to use that transit, and also as a way to at least help address some of the pressures that people are facing.
Yeah. An interesting question from the audience is, you had talked about on the Washington example of how long it had taken for what was not a mega project to get planned and brought to fruition, or is still not yet brought to fruition. What's the middle ground on the don't take 9 years to do something that's not $1 billion project, but also don't just show up and say, hey, we're doing this, and it's going in a month from now?
Yeah. I think that a lot of it comes down to figuring out the right scale and approach to public engagement, where I think that there are ways to do public engagement that are at greater scale, that engage more people than typically show up at the sort of desultory open houses, while also being a faster process than having these sort of months and months of open house meetings. And I think also it's really worth thinking about, can you do, one of the things that I hear a lot from people in transportation agencies who are thinking a lot about equity is the fact that rather than parachuting into neighborhoods when it's time to build a project, it's really important for transportation agencies to have more lasting relationships with neighborhoods. And that way, it doesn't feel like you have to sort of ramp up the public engagement apparatus, which takes a lot of time, and then ramp it down. But instead, there's actually a more steady relationship, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love that story about the example from Minneapolis about working with community-based organizations to have them staff the engagement and the ongoing discussion. It's really, really powerful. Talk about the role that sort of Uber and Lyft and some of the much covered controversy around sort of the private bus services that some of the tech companies are doing in San Francisco and elsewhere. And with those as sort of the examples, what is this broader picture of sort of the private versus the public when we think about transit and think about mobility in the future? How does that complicate some of this push that you're advocating for?
Right. So in terms of the private buses, this is not something that I think of as a huge problem. I know that in San Francisco there have been protests against the sort of corporate buses that often come into San Francisco in the morning and take workers to Silicon Valley companies. I don't think that's a problem with the bus service itself. Those are protests that more have to do sort of with the fact that people view those companies as playing a big role in inequality and the housing crisis in the Bay Area. There are lots of companies in cities all over the place that have private transportation, private sort of buses and shuttles for their employees, and I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with that. Uber and Lyft, on the other hand, have had a pretty pernicious effect on cities. And now it's become clear through the research that they are really worsening congestion in the neighborhoods that are already the most congested. The Uber and Lyft activity is concentrated in the densest neighborhoods. It's concentrated in the neighborhoods actually where we would hope that people are most likely to take transit. And it makes it sort of more and more, it makes it even more important that we carve out space on the street for transit. When you look at, sort of like the average speed of bus service in a place like New York or Chicago or LA, you tend to see the same story, which is that over the last decade, speeds have gradually sort of nibbled away. They've sort of declined very gradually, and it sort of adds up to death by 1,000 cuts. You ask, why has bus ridership been declining in those places? Well, the buses have been getting slower in all those places every year, and Uber and Lyft are a big culprit behind that. They're not the only one. There's a lot of additional traffic because of online deliveries, the fact that in some cases wealthier people have moved into urban centers. Those people are more likely to have cars, so there's more traffic. But I would say Uber and Lyft are one of a number of trends that really make it important to give transit space on the street. We can't treat a vehicle that is carrying 40 or 60 people. We have to give it sort of the priority it deserves over vehicles that are carrying maybe 2 or 3 people.
And I think that goes back to the transit streets idea of those are the types of projects that are that dedication of public space to enable those benefits for transit. Well, I would be a liar if I didn't read the one that has the bus on it. I would have read it earlier if it was an articulated bus, a really, really complex drawing. But what's your take on the difference between rail and bus and how that debate plays out? And I know you touch on this in the book, and I'd love to hear that.
I mean, it's funny in the transit world. Sometimes there's a lot of debate about what's better, rail or bus? And my colleague David Bragdon, the executive director at Transit Center, often says that is like debating whether a jacket is better than a sweater. It really depends on what the weather is, right? It depends on the context. And similarly, I think that I often come across this sort of argument that buses aren't sexy, rail is sexy, bus has a stigma, so if we want to build world-class transit, that means building rail. But if you actually go to world-class transit cities, if you go to London, if you go to Paris, you find a lot of great rail systems, and then you find really great bus service that feeds into it and that connects places which aren't quite dense enough to justify rail. You actually need both to provide abundant access throughout a region, because it's very hard to justify spending the money to build rail everywhere. Building rail everywhere and not having effective bus that fills in the gap is kind of the story of transit in places like Dallas. And that's a place that historically loves to brag about how many miles of light rail it has, but if you look at is the transit network effectively serving people? You really can't say that it is.
Great. Last question for you, Stephen. Which bus routes are you most excited to ride on your time here in Houston?
I haven't quite gotten to the point where I've picked out individual numbers, but I will say the last time I was in Houston, it was actually just a few months before the network redesign. So I'm really, really excited to sort of see to experience this next chapter. And then I think I'll be even more excited to come back a few years from now when some of the corridors outlined in Metro Next have gone in.
Well, I highly recommend the 56. It goes all the way from the medical center up the airline. I think those of you who are getting your book signed, give him your favorite bus route as well. So before we thank Stephen, a couple things. If you want to explore more about what the bus rapid transit pieces in Metro Next mean for Houston, the Kinder Institute just ran a series of blogs in the lead up to tonight's discussion that are available on the Urban Edge, featuring, among others, Christoph Spieler, who is oft quoted in Stephen's book. We have a few upcoming events that we wanted to make sure you all were aware of. On March 4th is our next Kinder Institute Forum, which is going to feature New York Parks Commissioner Mitchell J. Silver, discussing how planning and design can create equitable, inclusive, and fun places for residents. A great talk for those of you interested in what's happening here for parks and how we continue our great momentum there. Then on March 23rd through 25th, the Kinder Institute is partnering as a sponsor in the 3rd annual 10 Across Water Summit, which is going to bring experts from across the country to explore water and energy issues, the future of urban growth, resilience planning, and resource allocation. Some of those events, I believe, are taking place here in this lovely facility. And then, of course, on May 18th, our esteemed colleague, Stephen Kleinberg, will be presenting the 39th Annual Kinder Houston Area Survey at our annual luncheon, which is going to honor Reverend William Lawson. So we hope you can all join us for that as well. So thank you again for coming, and please join me in thanking Stephen Higashide. Thanks.